Thank you for the comments and for your questions, Sagi. Also, I'll try to address some of the things and maybe tie a few things together. First of all, as you said, Stefan, that there's a history to the violence in the Carpathian region at the time of World War II that unfolds across ideological divides and across regime and border changes. So when the Soviets arrive to the region in October 1944, it's by no means the end of the project. And here I'm also connecting to what you raised, Sagi, of basically obliterating a social fabric as a whole in order to turn it into a part of an ethno-national unit, right? Because the Soviet occupiers, as you mentioned, Stefan, immediately begin an assault against the small ethnic German population, and like everywhere in Eastern Europe, this is of course not something that it's all confined to the small Carpathian region. Wherever the Soviet occupiers arrive, they ask no questions about who these people are, right? How are they related in any way to Nazi Germany? To the German occupiers? What were their relations with Jews? Some of them, as the example you raised, Stefan, actually rescued Jews. They almost always ask no questions, and basically this small group of 15,000 Carpathendeutschen are destroyed completely. Those who do not flee are arrested, put in a camp in the region, and then deported very quickly to the Gulag system, where very few, of course, survived this ordeal. The Hungarian population in the region is also immediately under attack, and this is, of course, both populations are also identified as enemy populations, but it's not only the enemy populations, right? As with ethnic Germans across Eastern Europe that you mentioned, Alon, it's not only about revenge, right, of the German occupiers of this violence, although on the ground, of course, many acts of extreme violence, mass rape, and brutalities occur. But the logic is also about creating ethno-national units, because the whole idea of diverse societies, right, the idea of a society made of different ethno-national, ethno-religious, ethno-linguistic groups, right, is, as you mentioned, Sagi, at the end of World War II, perceived as something that is unstable, that does not work, that presents security problems, that leads to war, right, and that hampers economic activity. Right, so we're basically so just to about 40,000 ethnic Hungarians are arrested again, deported to the Gulag system. So we are very much indeed. I mean, what happens in the Carpathian region in that sense, and in Hungary more broadly, is part of a broader or much broader global history of the 20th century in the way of the disintegration, the crumbling of the imperial world, and this begins even before World War I, right, with the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire in the Balkans, right, at the end of the 19th century. It goes through World War I, the disintegration of the Euro-Asian empires in Europe, the German Empire, Austro-Hungary, which is very much relevant here, and of course the Tsarist, the Russian Empire, and the emergence instead of the imperial system of the international system of nation states, right, in various stages. And this is not only about Europe, this also then happens across the world after World War II with decolonization and the emergence of nation state across the globe. It's not in many cases it's horribly successful. We can think about Poland. We can think about perhaps Turkey after the Armenian genocide. Poland after World War II emerges as a clear ethno-national Polish state, with the deportations of the Germans, with the annihilations of the Jews, and the deportations and quote-unquote population exchanges between Ukrainians and Poles after World War II. But not always it's so successful. There are still, until today, community of ethnic Hungarians in the Carpathian region, right? This was incomplete project in a sense. Alon, you mentioned other projects that also, the ethnic Germans were of course a very, very complete project, but in India, Pakistan, it also remained an incomplete project, and also here. But we are talking about this indeed broader context in a way, right, of creating a very, very new way of living, right? A new kind of society, right? A new kind of state, the nation-state system, right? So this is one thing, and of course, at the base, the basic element of this new international system is the redefining of belonging, right? People who essentially are perceived as not belonging in one place and should be in another place, right? Or in some cases should be destroyed, murdered, right? And we see this. You mentioned Stefan, and I think you, Sagi, as well. The forced population exchanges between Greece and Turkey after World War I and after the war between Greece and Turkey. And there's actually some research about, with interviews with some of the survivors still of this exchange, and there's a documentary film called Twice a Stranger, with people that explain, these survivors and then also their descendants, that explain how they felt in this process, twice strangers. They were tagged as strangers in the place where they had lived for generations, right? Essentially not belonging in the view of the new states, right? And then strangers in the place where they were perceived in the view of these states as essentially belonging, right? Christians in the Ottoman Empire, in Turkey, and Muslims in Greece. So it's really, in essence, a restructuring of the sense of belonging in that sense. I want to come back to and connect to this issue of an incomplete process. And the thinking about incomplete processes, and in Southeast Europe, actually, there's a lot of incomplete processes in that sense. It's very important because we actually usually, and our times maybe are conducive to thinking in a very negative way, right? But the incomplete processes open a windows for us to think about how societies sometimes, to some extent, survive this extreme assault. And I want to come back to the Southeast Europe, to Romania and also Bulgaria. And as Stefan mentioned, thinking about Hungarian and Bulgarian borderlands during the war now is at the center of my research. So it's a broader Southeast European perspective that I'm working on now, trying to deconstruct these concepts: Holocaust, bystanders, anti-Semitism, collaborators, victims, perpetrators. And I want to, Alon, you mentioned that the convergence, right, of the Nazi project, of Nazi anti-Semitism with the different national or regional contexts defined in each case how and why Jews were annihilated, right? And what we see in Southeast Europe is also that this convergence or the tensions of this meeting points between the Nazi project and Hungarian project, the Romanian project, the Bulgarian project, also sometimes defined why it did not happen, right? And this is a very important point. And it also opens a window to think, again, more broadly about how we think and teach the Holocaust. Because, for example, it is more popular, and many people know that in Bulgaria, 50,000 Jews were rescued, right? 50,000 Jews remained alive until the end of the war because of a concerted effort of both Jews and non-Jews, of civil society, of the churches, of the parliament to rescue them, right? This is quite popular. In Romania, to the north, 350,000 Jews, 7 times more Jews, remained alive until the end of the war in a state that was led by an extreme xenophobe and anti-Semite, the military dictator Ion Antonescu, who engaged between the summer of 1941 and the summer of 1942 in the mass murder of Jews in Bessarabia, Bukovina, and then Transnistria, and from the summer of 1942 decided to change course and not deport the other 350,000 Jews in Romania to German hands. They were envisioned to be murdered in the Belzec death camp, in the Nazi Belzec death camp. Now, if we think only about, for example, anti-Semitism, right? Here, this term, as we usually use it, offers us no explanation whatsoever for what happened. Ion Antonescu did not become less anti-Semitic. He didn't start liking Jews, right? Or the other minority groups that the state was assaulting, right? We need to think more broadly about the vision of the greater Romania that Antonescu was thinking about how he saw the war, as you mentioned, Stefan, right, as a set of opportunities, but also limits, right? Because in summer 1942, when Antonescu understood that the war would be lost, right, by Nazi Germany, and the post-war world would not be a Nazi world, but would be an Allied world, right? It was clear that murdering Jews is not a good idea to realize a greater Romania idea, right? It doesn't mean that he wanted Jews in this greater Romania, and he didn't. He was then became engaged in various schemes of immigration and forced immigration, of population exchanges of various sorts of Jews, right? But we see a certain case where in an unlikely place like Romania, mass violence and mass murder did not happen, right? And where the basic way that we understand the Holocaust, and also here the comparison with Bulgaria is important, because no one talks about the rescue of Jews in Romania, of course, right? Everyone talks about the rescue of Jews in Bulgaria. No one talks about the rescue of Jews in Romania, and rescue and rescuers is another key concept, right, with emotional, political overtones, right, in the field. So this is another element of this broader context that Sagi you mentioned, right, of cases where the crystallization of the nation-state system remains incomplete, and remains incomplete until today. In Transylvania today, we still have a society made up of Hungarians and Romanians that in many cases works, right? So this is also an important point. So, and I'll end by responding to your question that you raised, Stefan, at the end, because indeed my research project, this path to that resulted in this book, began. I was a student here in Tel Aviv University when I decided that I want to deal with the Holocaust, and there's actually, I'm trying to think why I wanted to deal with the Holocaust, and there's actually no good reason. I think that it's mostly because I'm a Jew and an Israeli, and I grew up in Israel at least part of the time, and this was something in the air. I came to do a MA in Jewish history here in Tel Aviv University because that's how I thought about the Holocaust at the time, as an integral part of Jewish history. And then I met, I was fortunate to meet Yehuda Bauer, who gave a special seminar here in Tel Aviv University, and I was very inspired by Yehuda Bauer. And Yehuda Bauer, of course, was one of the founders of a school of thought that we still today call the Jerusalem School in Holocaust History, or in Jewish Studies and Holocaust Studies. And that's how I went into my project, to think about Jews, right? And my focus was like this, visually. It was about what happened to Jews. It was about Jewish history, right? And so I had certain kinds of expectations. I thought that I was going to write a dissertation when I went to the Stressler Center in the US about Jews in the Carpathian region, right? And the result, of course, is much more a book about modern European history, about the modern history of the Carpathian region. It is still very much about Jews, but it's within this frame, and it was published in a series on modern Central and Eastern Europe. So what happened is that when I went into the archives, and this kind of document like the one that I showed, it took me some time because I came to the research very committed, emotionally and personally, to the Jerusalem School, in that sense, right? And it took me some time at the Stressler Center, but mostly when I went into the archives and I started to see the connections that the Hungarian authorities themselves were making, right? When I started to read the documents and I started to see that looking at Jews like this is not enough, that actually if I want to know what happened to Jews, I need to start looking much more broadly. And what resulted eventually, if again to put it visually, is that literally I broadened the lens, right? And then I went back to Jews. But when you broaden the lens, the kind of questions that you ask, the sources is also different. The sources that you're looking for is also different. The archives sometimes that you're looking for are new kinds of archives that you haven't considered before, right? And eventually I came back to look at Jews, right, with a completely different perspective. So indeed, what I started with and what I ended with is absolutely different, and I actually hope that this will happen in the next project, right? So who knows, maybe I'll come back in a certain way, but thank you.
Thank you, Raz, thank you, Alon and Stefan, and of course thank you, Scott, for arranging everything, but above all, thank you, Raz, for